Okay, welcome back. And let's continue with the strategy. And this is the second part, which is strategy frameworks. Where's the chat room? Oh, there's the chat room. Okay, here we go. Okay, strategy frameworks. So as I mentioned, we have several frameworks for being able to create this distinctive strategy. The first is the 2x2 matrix. Second is we'll just overview business strategy. Then we'll discuss another framework called Ansof's opportunity matrix. And the third one is the Boston Consulting Group BCG model. Then we'll do a SWOT analysis. We'll talk about SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And we'll finish with the basic concepts of competitive advantage. So when it comes to strategy, we have 4 different types of strategy that can be described on a 2x2 matrix. One matrix is how broad your market will be, whether it will be a industry-wide market or a narrow market segment. The other is related to what is your particular advantage, either low cost or product uniqueness. Again, this is not a definitive strategy, but gives you a kind of framework for beginning to create your own distinctive strategy. So I just need to make a note here. And so if you have a low cost, wide market strategy, roughly speaking, it's a cost leadership strategy. If you have a unique product and a broad industry-wide, that would be a differentiation strategy. A narrow market segment, low cost, would be a low cost focused strategy. And a narrow market segment, unique product, would be a product differentiation focused strategy. So these 2x2 matrices are very important. When you might call this the consultant's toolbox. Whenever you see a complex problem, you might want to consider identifying 2 different dimensions to that problem. Ideally, these dimensions are separate. We call that orthogonal. So one dimension can be related to the advantages I described. The other dimension is your market scope, as outlined in this 2x2 matrix. So for each of these dimensions, you identify 2 extreme positions, such as broad or narrow, or low cost and product uniqueness. You set up the 2x2 matrix, so a total of obviously 4 positions or 4 cells in that 2x2 matrix, and you populate the cells. This 2x2 matrix is a very common approach to understanding business problems. And I encourage you, in whatever sort of business problem you have, whether it be in marketing or other business problems, to consider 2x2 matrix. Lots of companies pay millions of dollars to consultants to effectively do this task. So the better you can do it, obviously, that's very useful. So for example, if we look at an overview of all of business strategy, we can regard two different dimensions. One is the level of innovation, whether it's more radical innovation or more incremental innovation. Another way to look at it is the company focusing more on the future or on the present? Another dimension is whether it's more of a market pull, whether there are many inputs into the marketing decisions. So you get customers, you get the market information, you're pulled from the market, or if it's a technology push type approach where you have a technology, you try to push that onto the market. So push or pull strategy or a future present based strategy. So that's a 2x2 matrix. So we obviously have 4 different cells related to that. And you can see a summary, and these are famous books in business strategy. You may recognize some of them. So for example, Michael Porter, W. Chan Kim in the Blue Ocean Strategy, Edwards Deming, Out of the Crisis, Ram Charan, Execution, Tom Peters and Waterman, In Search of Excellence, and Chris Zook, Profit from the Core. So this results in 4 different cells. We can call this a positioning strategy in the upper right. We can call this a concentration strategy in the lower right. We can call this on the lower left an execution strategy. And on the upper left, we call this an adaptation strategy. In the positioning strategy, we hold a distinctive position. In the concentration, we focus on current core business. In the execution, we align the business to operational excellence. As we said, that's not a sustainable business strategy. So you notice Michael Porter is up here. And adaptation is to act quickly and creatively in response to events. So organizational learning is a key aspect. If we look at some big conglomerates that you're familiar with, Siemens is the German company is very technology driven. That would be approximately here. GE Healthcare is very focused on the market and execution. You might have heard about Six Sigma or product excellence and manufacturing excellence. And GE Healthcare actually helped push that business approach very substantially. So that's in the execution category. And then the Dutch conglomerate Philips is very consumer driven and adapts and creates different products based on the market pull. And so Philips would perhaps be considered more of an adaptation strategy. So this is on one page an overview of most of business strategy. And again, using a 2x2 matrix to elucidate that. So another framework for strategy is Ansoff's opportunity matrix. Based on what I showed you before, it's very similar. On one dimension, you have market-driven versus product-driven. And on the other dimension, you have existing markets versus new markets. So the 4 different strategies that correspond to this framework would be on the upper left, market penetration. You have existing products and existing markets. This is the safest strategy, but it's the least differentiated strategy, trying to take greater share of an existing market with an existing product. Then in the market-driven approach, where you're influenced by the market, but you're creating new markets, that would be a market development strategy. And then a new product in an existing market would be a product development strategy. And finally, the most risky strategy, but the most differentiated strategy, is new markets and new products. So an example of market penetration strategy would be Kraft Foods. Kraft is an American company that makes cheese, and they create all sorts of different packaging around the cheese. So the product is very similar. The market is obviously the same market, people who buy cheese. And it could be a product relaunch or increasing brand awareness. Kraft Foods does a market penetration strategy. Another example of market development would be McDonald's. So this is market-driven, but new markets. So many years ago, McDonald's entered into the breakfast market. So that was a new market driven by customer demand, but essentially existing products, and McDonald's goes into the breakfast market or morning market. An example of a product development, namely product-driven existing market strategy, would be Intel chips. So you constantly make faster and faster processors. And an example of the most risky product diversification strategy, which is new products, new markets. An example of that would be the iPhone. So these are the 4 types of market strategies in Ansof's opportunity matrix. And when you're doing your marketing plan, you should, for a final project, you should be using this matrix. So another matrix, again, 2x2, is the Boston Consulting Group model. And the dimensions that are described in this model are relative market generation or relative market share, cash generation, high versus low. Again, take the extreme positions for this dimension. And then the other dimension, which is separate dimension, is the market growth rate, or how much cash is used. So how much cash is made and how much cash is used to develop that market. So a very high cash generation and high growth rate would be what they call the stars. This is an area of the market that you want to position your company to be. On the opposite end is an area where you have very low market share and the market growth rate is already very low. They call these the dogs. And actually, I like dogs, and dogs are very nice animals. But Boston Consulting Group considers them bad, and they call this the dog category. And this is a market area that you don't want to enter. Low market share, low market growth. Areas in which you don't need to use a lot of cash and the growth rate is low, but your market share is high, are what are called cash cows. And many companies can find themselves here, but eventually as these cash cows attract other competitors, and unless there's a differentiated advantage, those will turn into dogs. So this is actually a good place to be, but can be dangerous over time. And then areas where you have a low market share, but potentially high market rate growth, they call these the question mark category, and could be something to explore, although the upper left-hand corner is the best one as a strategy. So if you have products, you want to identify your products in your mix along these categories and allocate resources accordingly. So build, hold, harvest, divest. So Build would be the stars, hold would be the question marks, harvest would be the cash cows, and divest, in other words, eliminate would be the dogs. So identifying these categories can be a way of allocating your resources and a strategic framework. So SWOT analysis, which is a summary for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, is a very common framework for corporate strategy and marketing strategy. And the two dimensions are the external dimensions, what is outside your company, and the other dimension is the internal dimension, the capabilities and resources inside. So outside, inside. So this is internal and external. Those are the dimensions. And of course, according to this two by two matrix, you have the extreme positions. On the internal side, you have the strengths. That's why this is S, internal positive factors. And then on the side, you have your corporate or firm or personal or organizational weaknesses. That's the negative side. And then on the outside, you have the opportunities on the outside. This would be the external positive. And then you have the threats on the outside. That would be the external negative. So again, this framework, 2x2 framework, gives you a framework for strategy. And the four strategies, well, they should all be mixed. These are not exclusive strategies. But the point is, in your strategy, what will be your strength opportunity strategies? Which of the company's strengths can be used to maximize the opportunities outside? The weakness opportunity strength would be, what can you do to minimize the company's weaknesses in relation to the outside opportunities? And these strengths threat strategy is, what can you do with your company's strengths to minimize the threats from the outside? And weakness threat strategies, how can you minimize a company's weaknesses to avoid the threats you identify? So this SWOT analysis is very common in company business. So let's finish this section with competitive advantage and disruptive innovation. So I go back to Michael Porter and his concept of differentiated strategy. And he has these generic strategies: competitive advantage, low cost differentiation. We talked about this before. And competitive edge, broad target, narrow target. And these are the four strategic positions: cost leadership, differentiation, cost focus, and differentiation focused. Now, there's a interesting connection between competitive advantage, low cost, and disruptive innovation. You might remember that early on I said that operational excellence is not a strategy, and certainly not a sustainable strategy. So you might argue, why is Michael Porter talking about lower cost, whereas Michael Porter was saying distinct strategy? So in this case, lower cost is not the same as operational excellence. Let me actually raise a chat room. Where's the chat room? There we go. So I'm going to ask a question in the chat room. How can low cost be distinct? Or in other words, why is lower cost not always the same as operational excellence? So how can low cost be distinct? What is the difference between low cost and operational excellence? Any thoughts? You can put this in the chat room. Hello? Everybody there? Do any thoughts on why lower cost is not the same as operational excellence? Anybody care to comment? Okay, we need high cost to make money, but low cost we won't make much, we'll sell more. So let me talk about this in a little more detail. So low cost is sometimes achieved by operational excellence. So you do things more effectively, you have better best practices. And as I said, operational excellence is not a strategy because other people will follow that. So Korean companies that are focusing on low cost for operational excellence will eventually be matched or overtaken by Chinese companies or other companies. That's a very important thing. A pure low cost strategy is not exactly a differentiated strategy. And many Korean companies are experiencing this competition over the past 10 years, and that's become more of a problem at the government level, the economic level, etc. This is why I raise these issues, because this affects us and companies here, as well as, of course, wherever you are in the world. These are marketing strategy issues. So I'll give you the example of Samsung. So in the 1980s and 1990s, the best televisions in the world were Sony televisions. That was considered the best quality, and Sony had the best televisions. And Samsung knew this, Korean people knew this, American people, everybody knew that Sony televisions were the best. And they had the brand name Sony Trinitron. You may not be aware, but that was the best televisions. And Samsung came out with lower cost televisions. But this is a very important difference. In the early 2000s, Samsung made a strategic decision to focus on digital televisions. In other words, LCDs, and then later LEDs, OLEDs, and so forth, but LCDs in the beginning. Samsung made a strategic decision. They would focus on digital TV, and Sony was the best at analog TV. And the digital TV was also lower cost, but it was actually not as highly developed as the analog TVs, CRT of Sony. So you might remember Sony television was a huge thing because the technology, and so it was more expensive. The shipping was more expensive. So Samsung came out with lower cost solution, but it wasn't just lower cost from operational excellence. It was lower cost from a distinct advantage, specifically the concept of disruptive innovation. So now, 20 years later, the best televisions in the world are not Sony televisions. The best televisions in the world are Samsung and LG televisions, which adopted a low-cost strategy, but not purely low-cost, just cheaper, components, etc., but low-cost based on disruptive innovation, different innovation. In other words, digital. Sony did not see that strategy, and they continued to make improvements on the analog televisions until that disruptive strategy or disruptive technology replaced them. So that's where low cost can be a strategy, but the low cost has to be based on disruptive technology. In other words, a distinct product. Low cost just based on doing something a little bit, the existing technology, a little bit lower cost, is not sustainable. And in fact, now Samsung televisions have that same problem. Is Chinese televisions are based on digital technology, are getting better and better, have approached the quality, and have an operational excellence lower cost than the Samsung televisions. So in order to achieve a low cost strategy, we need a new disruptive strategy or disruptive technology. So I will explain that in this chart. This is time on the horizontal axis and product performance on the vertical axis, how good the product is. And this high-end, let's talk about the mainstream. This is the mainstream market performance. In other words, what people want. And the incumbent is the existing company, incrementally improves that technology over time. So this is kind of like the Sony. And then down here is a poor performance, less advanced, or I shouldn't say advanced, less performing technology with a new entrant or new type of technology. So this Sony would be the analog TV, which got very, very good. This one would be the early digital TV, which was not as good. But over time, that disruptive technology also improves. It has a lower cost until it matches the mainstream performance expectation. And as soon as it basically matches the mainstream, as soon as it reaches the mainstream, it will replace the more expensive technology. So cost leadership based on a disruptive technology is a powerful strategy. So let's talk about the marketing mix, the 4 Ps. We'll talk about this very quickly. Marketing, product strategies, distribution strategies, promotion strategies, pricing strategies. So what is marketing? We talked about this last time. It's the marketing mix of product, pricing, placement, and distribution. So what type of product do you produce? Is it going to be digital TV or analog TV? What is the pricing? Where are we going to place that? How are you going to sell it? Online, offline, B2B, B2C, which channels, and how are you going to promote it? So we talked about inside out versus the marketing environment, understanding the market and shaping the market. So let's talk briefly about some product strategies. To understand the product strategies, we should understand product categories, tangible product, intangible product, or services. What are the benefits, the core benefits, the actual benefits, the augmented benefits? various product decisions. How do we design the product? What quality do we choose? What are the features? What are the branding? And the product development. How do we generate ideas? How do we analyze the ideas? What are the technical and market considerations? And how do we continue to update and review? So these are various aspects of product strategy. We will talk about this in more detail. So marketing strategy is a part of strategy, and a part of marketing strategy is product strategies. And these are some of the considerations there. So the second P in marketing is the placement or distribution strategies. So what is distribution? It's the set of firms and individuals that take title, assist in transferring title to a good or service as it moves from the company to the customer. So in increasingly global marketplace, planning how you distribute the product is increasingly important. So these are different types of distribution channel types. We'll have a whole lecture on these distribution strategies. We have a long distribution channel where we go from the manufacturer, import, wholesaler, retailer, end user, or we have very short distribution channels which goes directly from the manufacturer to the end user, and all sorts of variations of that distribution in between. We have a push versus pull strategy in distribution. In a push strategy, the producer does various marketing activities on the intermediaries, and those intermediaries, the distributors, etc., will then do marketing activities for the end user. In a pull strategy, the end user will basically, through the intermediaries and so forth, make inputs into the producer, and then the marketing activities directly on the end user. So a push versus pull distribution strategy. So key decision points in strategies, distinct strategies for distribution are you going to do extensive or selective distribution? Are you going to do exclusive or open distribution? So for example, VHS versus Betamax. A key part of the marketing strategy was the distribution strategy. Sony said, we are only going to do this through Sony products. And that made it very limited to Sony-related machines and Sony-related content. Whereas Betamax said, we're going to have an open distribution strategy. Everyone can make our format and just pay a licensing fee. Are you going to have a short or a distribution channel, or are you going to have a long distribution channel? Are you going to have direct to consumer, or are you going to have intermediaries? And then horizontal versus vertical marketing systems. The third P in marketing is promotion strategies. So we have different promotion strategies: advertising, personal selling, public relations, sales promotion, direct marketing. We will spend a whole lecture on different strategies for promotion. And so there are different aspects. Are these going to be mass versus customized? What are the payment aspects? What are the costs related? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these types of strategies? And again, we will talk about this in more detail. And then the fourth P in the marketing mix is the pricing strategies. So we can have market-based pricing strategies, or product-based pricing strategies, or cost and value-based pricing strategies. So pricing is actually very important, because actually of the four Ps, price is the only one that actually involve money coming in. The product, the placement, and the promotion all have costs, and price is what will cover all of these costs. So pricing is a very important part of the marketing strategy. So what are some of the factors in making a pricing strategy? Your fixed and variable costs. What are the competitive prices? What are the company objectives? What are some of the vision and values What are your positioning strategies? If you're going to have cost leadership or you're going to have product differentiation, will influence your pricing. And what are your target groups and what are they willing to pay? Are you focusing on wealthy consumers? Are you talking about mass market consumers? This various pricing strategies. In the technology life cycle, which we'll have a whole lecture on, that will also influence the pricing. So in the early days of a technology, with a high technology, the pricing may be higher. As the technology becomes more of a commodity, the pricing may actually obviously go down. So we have product life cycle strategies related to sales, cost, profits, marketing objectives, pricing strategy, promotion strategy. And so a very important thing is these strategies change over time. So as the product is introduced, we will have different strategies compared to when a product is declining over the product life cycle. And we'll have a whole lecture related to the technology life cycle and the product cycle and the different marketing strategies. So finally, the marketing plan. I'll go over the components for the marketing plan. So the final project, which will be a group project, so you should begin to form your groups now, and I'll give further instructions over the coming weeks, is to create a idea for a product or a service. It doesn't necessarily have to be business. So for example, it could be vaccines, it could be about COVID-19, it could be about education. So marketing, as I said, is not just a business concept, but you should make executive summary. You should do an environmental analysis of the company's current situation with respect to the environment. You should do a SWOT analysis, or strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, that we talked about, analyzing the outside opportunities and threats and the inside strengths and weaknesses. If you can mute your marketing objectives, marketing strategies, which we talked about many of those already, marketing implementation and evaluation and control. So these are going to be the components of the marketing plan that you'll do in a group presentation near the end of the course. So start thinking about that, thinking about which groups you'll get together, think about possible products or service you want to create a marketing plan around. These last two categories are not going to be as important, so focus on these: the executive summary, the environmental analysis, the SWOT analysis, the marketing objectives, and the marketing strategies. We have two sets of readings so far that are in your notes, or I should say on LMS. We have the overview readings. I suggest you go through these if you haven't already. And then we have the readings for this week. And then next week's lecture, I will upload the readings by Monday. And we will have a discussion session during this time, in the second half of this time, to discuss those readings. But please do these readings. We may discuss some of these next week as well, in addition to the ones that I send out on Monday. So by Monday, you'll have 3 sets of readings for the 3 weeks that we have done. And you should expect to discuss some of these readings at the second half of the session next Friday. So the readings, this is a classic one: Michael Porter's What is Strategy, Lee Cooper's Strategic Marketing Planning for Radically New Products. Remember, new products are very important for effective strategy. And then an interesting article, The End of Strategy. So one very important concept that I should keep in mind is we're entering into a new world of organizational innovation. In other words, part of making a strategy is not just a strategy, but creating an organization that can adapt and change to that strategy. In other words, organizing the firm or the company to be able to do strategy or to adapt is in fact a strategy. If you have a unique type of organization that's very adaptable and can match market needs and move quickly and so forth, that is a strategy. So if you have a national strategy of addressing pandemics, uh, trying to get information, messaging the people, organizing resources, and have an organization that can do that, that's a strategy that makes Korea able to effectively manage COVID-19. Maybe not perfectly, but but an organization or a country that doesn't have those capabilities, doesn't have that organizational strategy, if you will have more difficulty addressing those challenges. So we're not going to talk about this in detail, but this article that I want you to read is about the end of strategy, something to think about. Strategy means you want to have some differentiated position. But if the world is changing so fast, is it possible that strategy no longer is very useful? In other words, Samsung had a very good, and LG, but Samsung starting that had a very good strategy of doing digital television, doing digital disruptive technology. That lasted for about 20 years. It's continuing to last, but is now under pressure. So that's 20 years. That technology cycle getting shorter and shorter, is it possible that distinctive strategies start to become less effective over time? And so do we no longer need strategy? That argues again for what I talked about earlier, to have organizational culture as being, in a sense, the best strategy for the long term. If we have an organizational culture that appreciates innovation and open messaging and all these things that I mentioned, they may be very soft, but when it comes to things like economic strength and response to pandemics and so forth, these organizational cultural aspects are very important. Every culture has strengths and weaknesses. I mentioned about strengths of Korean businesses and Korean response to COVID-19, but I also talked about aspects in Korean business that are also challenging. Tillingot, different thing, bad thing. So the pressure to do the same thing can be a challenge to developing effective strategies. So there's no perfect business, there's no perfect culture, no perfect country, but we can try to achieve more of that through better strategies. So strategy is very important. So next week we will continue with understanding the market and focus on customers and value. Understanding customers and understanding value in more detail. So thank you, take care. If you have any questions, you can always email me. Let's look at the chat room. We can, I think we should have, we have 50 people. I think we should have 5 people in each group. Okay. Any questions? We're going to sign off very shortly. Okay, well, take care. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. And you'll hear from me on LMS on Monday. And I will see you next Friday. Thank you very much and take care.